that we love Canada with every fiber of our being. The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperations, is over.
Welcome back. Canada is looking to boost trade with other North American trading partners, namely Mexico, as both countries try to work out a trade agreement with the volatile U.S. under President Trump.
Prime Minister Carney is coming to strengthen the Canada-Mexico relationship. Apart from the trade deal we have, it's to boost commerce, investment, and the economy in certain sectors.
Trade route that might rewrite the balance of North America is now on the table, and it doesn't run through the United States. The so-called Northern Corridor, stretching nearly 9,200 kilometers from Prince Rupert in Canada all the way to Mazatlán in Mexico, has been described as a direct bypass that could leave Washington watching from the sidelines. Analysts warn that if this project reaches its full potential, as much as $160 billion in annual trade, close to 10% of all commerce between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., could be rerouted away from American customs checkpoints. The result? Washington could forfeit billions of dollars in revenue each year, with some estimates pointing toward a $4 billion hole in its budget. And here's the part that stings even more. This scenario could unfold before Trump's 30% tariffs are even activated on August 1st, which leads to an unsettling question. If America's neighbors can already build a system that sidesteps U.S. control, what happens when those tariffs push even more trade away from American borders? Before we begin, hit that like button if you're finding this eye-opening. It really helps us beat the algorithm. If the shock of lost customs fees hints at what's possible, the scale of the Northern Corridor's infrastructure plan makes the picture even clearer. This is not just about laying down new tracks. It has been framed as a $120 billion strategy to fundamentally reshape how trade in North America might work. Announced jointly by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, the project stretches an estimated 4,400 miles, or over 7,000 kilometers, and has already been described by some observers as nothing less than the backbone of rail and port logistics for the continent. Canada has reportedly committed billions of dollars toward upgrades at Prince Rupert, including $2.5 billion for multi-terminal expansion, while Mexico is said to be investing around $1.6 billion to strengthen 6 of its major ports. Together, these moves suggest a deliberate attempt to build an end-to-end system where goods can bypass U.S. routes entirely. And here's the critical link to the bigger story. When infrastructure of this magnitude is deployed not as a domestic project, but as a continental strategy, the power to define the rules of trade may start shifting away from Washington. The question is no longer whether the corridor is just another construction effort, but whether it could become the foundation of a new economic order. If you've made it this far, you probably care. Consider subscribing to stay updated. If massive railways and ports represent the physical backbone of this strategy, then the customs system may be its invisible shield. Instead of relying on servers and checkpoints inside the United States, the Northern Corridor is designed with blockchain-based customs technology, a digital framework that could allow data to flow securely and directly between Canada and Mexico. In such a model, Washington would no longer hold the master keys to regional trade information. The implications are significant. By bypassing traditional American processing, the corridor might eliminate the transaction fees that currently sustain U.S. customs operations, fees that averaged more than $30 per shipment and, according to estimates, brought in over $1 billion for U.S. authorities in 2024 alone. On top of that, a unified digital portal could compress clearance times dramatically, cutting the process from several days to as little as 24 hours. Supporters of the project describe this approach as a departure schedule, not a political timetable, signaling that efficiency, not negotiation, drives the rollout. For Washington, that framing is troubling because it suggests that pressure from the U.S. may simply be irrelevant to the system's operation. If digital customs signals a technological escape from U.S. oversight, the broader economic opportunity lies in Canada's ability to break free from its historic dependency on the American market. For decades, more than 3/4 of Canadian exports have flowed south across the border, leaving Ottawa vulnerable whenever Washington shifts policy. By comparison, Canada's trade with Mexico in 2024 amounted to just a fraction of that scale, underscoring how lopsided the relationship has been. The Northern Corridor introduces a chance to rebalance. By linking Canada directly not only with Mexico, but also with deep-water Pacific ports, the pathway could serve as a springboard to Asian and European markets. Instead of watching 75% of its exports tied to the whims of a single neighbor, Canada may now envision a diversified structure where goods move freely across multiple continents. Some analysts even frame this as a revolutionary moment, comparable to the transcontinental railroads of the 19th century that unlocked entire new regions of commerce. Whether this becomes a similar turning point remains to be seen, but the possibility alone signals a shift in mindset. Canada is no longer only reacting to U.S. policy, but considering how to chart its own independent course. Just as Canada seeks to step out of America's shadow, Mexico's role in the Northern Corridor could shift from peripheral to pivotal. Traditionally positioned as Canada's third-largest trading partner after the U.S. and China, Mexico often operated as the junior player in the region's economic triangle. But with the new rail and port system, that perception may no longer hold. Upgrades at the port of Mazatlán, now directly linked into the corridor's rail network, provide Mexico with the kind of logistical leverage it has rarely enjoyed. Instead of serving mainly as a low-cost manufacturing hub feeding into the U.S., Mexico could emerge as the primary gateway connecting North and South, a role once monopolized by American ports. In practice, this means agricultural goods, industrial inputs, and even electric vehicle components might one day move straight through Mexican ports without ever crossing U.S. territory. For Washington, the message is stark. Mexico is no longer just a side player in continental trade, but a potential anchor in a supply chain that deliberately routes around the United States. If Mexico's upgraded role strengthens the corridor's foundation, the true driving force may lie in the rare political and economic alignment between Ottawa and Mexico City. Both governments, confronted with the prospect of sweeping U.S. tariffs, appear to have reached the conclusion that fragmentation is weakness. Rather than approaching Washington as two separate and vulnerable partners, Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Claudia Sheinbaum have opted for what some observers call a tag team approach, a unified front under the Canada-Mexico Action Plan. This initiative is not a narrow trade pact. It extends well beyond rail lines and port terminals, stretching into critical sectors such as renewable energy projects, joint agricultural strategies, financial cooperation, and even environmental resilience. The ambition, at least on paper, is to knit together a web of collaboration robust enough to channel investment and commerce along paths that operate independently of U.S. gatekeeping. What makes this alignment striking is the deliberate breadth of its design. By combining infrastructure with policies in security and finance, the two countries are not merely responding to tariffs, but attempting to preempt future pressure points. The emphasis on maritime and overland corridors that steer clear of U.S. customs stations reinforces this outlook, pointing to a system where Canada and Mexico can dictate their own terms of engagement with global markets. The underlying lesson seems clear. One-on-one bargaining with Washington exposes each country to sudden shocks and policy swings, but acting together could offer enough scale and coordination to tilt the balance of power across North America in ways the U.S. has rarely had to confront. For Washington, the potential fallout from the Northern Corridor reaches far beyond the immediate question of customs revenue. At risk is the architecture of America's industrial system itself, the networks of production, supply, and employment that have defined the U.S. economy for generations. Should even a fraction of the estimated $160 billion in trade flows be redirected toward Canada and Mexico, the effects would not be limited to balance sheets. They could seep into the everyday functioning of entire industries. Manufacturing sectors that once took U.S. dominance for granted, steel, automotive parts, agricultural processing, and even the fast-growing battery industry, might slowly find themselves restructured around hubs outside American borders. The Midwest, long considered the beating heart of U.S. auto production, could see investment diverted, suppliers relocating, and communities dependent on factory wages entering a period of prolonged uncertainty. Analysts warn that the exposure is not abstract. It could translate into real decisions about where new plants are built and where existing ones are downsized. What makes the risk more severe is the timing. America's fiscal position is already under immense pressure, with national debt surpassing $37 trillion and interest payments consuming a larger share of the federal budget each year. In that environment, Even a modest decline in competitiveness or tax revenue could amplify strains on public finances. Taken together, the threat is not just economic contraction, but a weakening of the very resilience the U.S. has relied upon to project strength at home and abroad. The Northern Corridor is not just a regional project. It has the potential to redraw the map of global commerce. For the first time, North America could host a major trade artery that bypasses the United States entirely. With direct links running from Canada to Mexico, the pathway opens two doors, one leading out to Asia through Pacific ports and the other toward Europe through the Atlantic. In this scenario, Washington risks being pushed to the margins. Canada and Mexico, once seen as secondary players, could consolidate a new strategic role by acting as gatekeepers to global trade flows. Some analysts describe it as a test case for a new order, one where infrastructure and technology, not political dominance, dictate who sets the rules. The unanswered question is whether the United States can adapt. Will Washington find a way to reassert itself, or will power continue to slip away right in its own neighborhood? And that brings us to the bigger picture. If the Northern Corridor truly signals the rise of infrastructure-led geopolitics, then the U.S. may be facing more than just an economic challenge. It may be confronting a new framework where influence is earned by building, not by dictating. The question is, will America adjust to this new reality, or will it allow its neighbors to redefine the balance of power across the continent? Thanks for sticking around. If you found this valuable, like and subscribe to support more content like this.